Hello, my name is Melvin Barnes, and welcome to the Cultural Revolution, Module 1. In this module, we're going to talk about the events that ultimately led up to the Cultural Revolution, the years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 up until about 1965. First things first, we need to establish the questions that will stretch across not only this module, but the following two modules. The overarching questions on the Cultural Revolution. The first question is, what was the Cultural Revolution? The second question is, who was responsible for the Cultural Revolution? The third question is, what were the origins of the Cultural Revolution? And then finally, what were the long-term consequences of the Cultural Revolution for China and the rest of the world? For this first video, we're going to focus on two essential questions. First, was Mao Zedong a dictator? And second, how did Mao lose his influence in the early 1960s? But before we get started, let's locate the movement. There's a little bit of debate about when the Cultural Revolution begins and when it ends, but for this module, we're going to say the Cultural Revolution began in 1966 and ended in 1976. Each video will have its own theme, and the theme for this video is Competing Visions for China. So, the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. Specifically October 1st. This is the day when Mao proclaimed to the country that they were establishing a new People's Republic of China after many years of civil war against Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China. So, after claiming victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, Mao, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and his cohort declared that new China would lean to one side. And what they meant by that was they would favor the Soviet Union over the United States in the West in the Cold War. The People's Republic of China started to produce its economic plans in the 1950s, and in doing so, they borrowed the Soviet model. And this model had been very successful for the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 1930s. It stressed heavy industry above almost everything else. Now, this heavy industry accounted for about 88% of the Chinese budget during its first 5-year plan, from 1953 to 1957. In producing this plan, the People's Republic of China focused on machine building, fuel, electric power plants, metallurgy, and a lot of other things. Only about 11% of the economic investment was dedicated towards light industries. When you think light industries, those are things like textiles, so producing clothes. And during that first 5-year plan, the economy grew rapidly. It grew at about 15% annually. And it also fostered rapid urbanization. Chinese people were moving from the countryside into the cities so that they could earn a better living and build for themselves a better life. So, for some, the plan did have drawbacks. The first 5-year plan did a great job of building heavy industry, but it didn't do much for the countryside, people who were farmers and lived outside of China's cities. In fact, the growth that China saw in the agricultural sector was actually quite small, only close to 3%, and that barely kept up with population growth. So, as the economy grew, we also saw new modes of inequity. If you lived in the countryside, your life wasn't changing all that much. But if you lived in the city, there was a lot more growth and a lot more going on. In fact, there was a massive boom in education opportunities for people who lived in the cities. But if you were a peasant and worked in the fields, your life really hadn't changed all that much. So even though China's economy was improving, people were being left behind. And since the Chinese peasantry had been the backbone of Mao's communist revolution, leaving them behind, for him, was untenable. Before moving forward, we have to take a slight detour to talk about events in the Soviet Union. In 1953, Joseph Stalin, that's the guy on the top right, dies. He was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1952, and he was the man who helped the country defeat Adolf Hitler in World War II. He was also known for being a ruthless dictator, and he was responsible for the death of millions. But after his death, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, his successor, that's the guy on the bottom right sitting next to Mao, he ends up denouncing Stalin for his ruthlessness and also importantly for his cult of personality. Mao realized that if Joseph Stalin could be denounced, then he too could be denounced one day, attacked by his own party. And with Stalin gone and following his denunciation by Nikita Khrushchev, Mao began to stray away from the Soviet development model. In the end, Mao comes up with a rather revolutionary plan. You see, the thinking at the time was that countries moved through distinct phases of development. The first phase was feudalism, the second phase was capitalism, followed by socialism, and then the highest phase, communism. Communism was the highest form of economic development. It was a stage in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. This was the ideal. But how does a country get there? Typically, countries that are in pursuit of communism would develop a high degree of industrialization and wealth. From there, they would be able to spread the wealth throughout the population so that everyone could have a high standard of living. But what this meant was you had to get rich first. Mao theorized that China could go straight to communism, leaping past socialism and arguably capitalism, and basically get there without developing the prerequisite wealth. This resulted in Mao launching the ill-fated Great Leap Forward in 1958. This was Mao's broadest attempt to get the entire country involved in this modernization effort. If you look at the image on the right, you'll see people huddled around these circular objects. What those are furnaces located in the countryside. Mao decided that he was going to be able to industrialize the countryside at the same time that he industrialized the city. He wanted to use these furnaces to develop steel. His idea was to develop enough steel to surpass Britain in 15 years, and then surpass the United States shortly after that. Unfortunately, the Great Leap Forward did not play out as planned. The ill-fated Great Leap Forward proved disastrous almost immediately. In 1959, the Chinese general Peng Dehuai, he's the guy on the far right, openly criticized Mao's Great Leap Forward at the Lushan plenum. He warned that after traveling the countryside, it was clear that the Great Leap Forward was going to cause a severe famine and that many people stood to lose their lives. By the 1960s, it was clear that the Great Leap Forward was an absolute failure. It had produced a massive agricultural famine that, depending on who you listen to, killed between 15 and 30 million Chinese people. It also resulted in the final split between China and the Soviet Union. When Mao deviated China from the Soviet path, the Soviets were not all that happy, and ultimately the ideological struggle that resulted ended up making the Soviets recall all of the 1,400 specialists that they had sent to China to help in their industrial and agricultural development. So, because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, in the early 1960s, Mao was essentially sidelined. He remained the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, but he could no longer set party policy. The people who were brought in to right the ship after Mao's Great Leap Forward was Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Liu Shaoqi is the guy on the top left, and Deng Xiaoping is the guy on the right. What did all of this amount to? Essentially, you had two competing views for how to develop China into the future. You had Mao's more revolutionary model that wanted to use the Chinese spirit and revolutionary drive to overcome China's poverty, and then you had Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping's more conservative model that was more in line with the Soviet heavy industry development model. Turning to our questions, was Mao Zedong a dictator? To answer this question, you'll have to ask yourself whether or not Mao wielded absolute power in the People's Republic of China at that time. Looking now at how Mao lost his influence in the early 1960s, in order to answer this question, you'll need to think a little bit about the outcomes of the Great Leap Forward.